culpa. So,
I
all
do.
right. Is everything all going then? Yeah, looks like it is. Let's go ahead and start. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. Hello, Karen. Good to see you. Yeah, and Loanne, Anja, Laverne, Cyril, or Cindy, and Laura. Oh, yes, great. Wonderful. And welcome, everyone here in the Gompa as well. Let's go ahead and start with just a short meditation, just so we can come into this space and set our motivation together. So let's just spend a few minutes on the breath, focusing the mind, trying to let go of whatever distractions or preoccupations we might have from our day. Just kind of breathe in calm presence and breathe out any of that distraction, you know, anything that's keeping you from being here fully. So we'll do meditation on the breath starting now. So now let's set our motivation. And as you know, we're working with this topic of anger tonight. Maybe just kind of look at your own life and see how this particular state of mind operates in terms of your own experiences, the interactions you have with others, or even just the thoughts that you have during the day, taking in whatever it is that's going on in our world, in our country. And we know that when those thoughts, become more prominent in our minds, when they become stronger, we can do harm to others as well as ourselves. So when we come together for a class where we're looking at how to work with anger, it is important that we think about both sides of that. We're here initially to develop our own patience, our ability to overcome the mind of anger, to kind of even learn from it when it does arise, to cultivate the qualities that we need, qualities that will help us to keep more at peace, in harmony with the world around us, regardless of what is going on. How wonderful that we can be here exploring this topic with that motivation, so we ourselves can find peace. But because we're also interacting with others and they're frequently the object of our anger, it's important that we generate a motivation to be here for them. Because we recognize that the degree to which we are able to tame our own minds, we then can be a more peaceful influence on others and perhaps over time eventually help them to pacify their own minds, to work with their own anger. So we want to hold that more far-reaching attitude. We're here to have an immediate effect on others in terms of calming our own minds, but over time to be able to benefit all beings by helping them to remove their anger, their delusions, help them to find the peace that they seek. Okay, then you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. Okay, so again, thanks for coming to this little class tonight. And I Again, anger is something I teach on frequently. In fact, I'm pulling a little bit of the material from this for this evening from like a 6 or 7 long course that I do on working with anger called Finding Calm in the Storm. So anyway, I think we're in the storm. We need to find calm. So let's go ahead and start. I wanted to start by sharing a few quotes from Master Shantideva. Most of you know this great Indian master who wrote the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, it's often called. Oh, what's it doing? Got really weird. Okay, I don't know what happened there. Let me pull out of this. Don't save. And then let me pull up my Zoom thing again and see if I can figure out what went on there. Somehow it got moved around, I think, is all that happened. But let's see. Okay, working with anger. All right, now let's go to screen share and see what happens. So again, Master Shantideva, this is from his chapter on patience. If you know that text, there's 10 chapters to it, and the one on patience is really pretty incredible. But actually, I'm sorry, this actually is not from that chapter. It's from the chapter immediately before that, where he's talking about patience. In that chapter, he's talking about how all the practices of a bodhisattva, these 6 perfections, are all about developing our minds. It's not about things external. And that's what he starts off talking about in regard to these verses that I'm going to share with you. He says, unruly beings are as unlimited as space. They cannot possibly all be overcome. But if I overcome thoughts of anger alone, this will be equivalent to vanquishing all foes. So the idea is, again, we could think that maybe we can get rid of everybody in the world who's an enemy, a foe, somebody we disagree with, somebody from the other side. But this is a crazy thought, right? Because would we ever be able to do that? And it says if we overcome thoughts of anger on our side, it'll be equivalent to doing that, because once we do that, then we really don't have any enemies, any foes. And he uses this beautiful analogy. Where would I find, or possibly find, enough leather with which to cover the surface of the earth? You might think, oh, and especially this is true in New Mexico, that I wouldn't dare go out with, shoes or something. If you were to walk around the desert or walk around a lot of places here, you'd end up torturing your feet, right? So you might have this idea, well, wouldn't it be nice to cover the whole earth with leather, with something smooth that I could walk on and never get pierced by any sort of thorn or what have you? And, there's not enough leather to cover the entire surface of the earth. But, he says, wearing leather just on the soles of my shoes is equivalent to covering the earth with it. And this is, again, a nice analogy for what we're trying to do in this work. We recognize that we're never going to be able to get rid of all the difficult stuff, the things that challenge us, that make our life uncomfortable. We can't get rid of all those things outside of ourselves, but we can protect our own minds. If we put that kind of armor, wear the shoes, if you will, of patience, well, then we can go wherever we want, and it won't matter. So he concludes this little section on how patience is all a practice of the mind, not something you change externally. He says, likewise, it is not possible for me to restrain the external course of things. But should I restrain this mind of mine, well, what would be the need to restrain all else? And if we do the work on the inside, well, then again, you can go wherever you wish and be with whoever you want and watch the news as often as you want. And you're never going to be perturbed by all of that because you've tamed your own mind. And of course, as I said, this is from that chapter 5, where he starts to move into his discussion of the perfections. And he's just pointing out how all the practices that we engage in Buddhism are really about changing the inside, not about changing the outside, though obviously when there are occasions where we can change the outside in a nonviolent and beneficial way, well, then we can do that. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. It's not to say that we totally detach ourselves from what's going on the outside, because others are also affected by what's going on the outside. But if we try to go about that type of work without having tamed our minds, then invariably we're going to, cause problems and difficulties. So this is the idea of what we're going to be looking at tonight. And I have divided up tonight into a little outline where the topics, which are pretty much drawn from the wonderful description that's put together for this course from Land of Medicine Buddha, really looking at the nature of anger, kind of what is this mind, to understand the details of it, if you will. We all know it from our own experience what it is, but it's good to look at a description of it, and then also to look at its counterpart, patience, because this is what we're trying to cultivate, is to have this mind of patience that is going to remain undisturbed in the face of whatever it is that we encounter. We're going to take a little look at how anger arises. It is important that we understand the Buddhist view of this because there are factors that play a role in it that we need to be somewhat attentive to. And then the effects of anger, just a little bit of that, because that is actually one way we can curtail our anger is by understanding, especially again, the harmful effects of anger, the disadvantages of following that mind. And then finally, we'll look at the antidotes to anger. There are a lot of antidotes to anger that are set out in the Buddha's teachings, but we'll take a look at a number of those. We'll see how many of those I'm able to squeeze in the session tonight. So I'm quoting a lot tonight from Working with Anger by Venerable Thupten Chodron. If you wish to kind of pursue this subject further, that's really a wonderful book. And by the way, I'll make these slides available to Diane here, the SPC, and she'll make them available to all of you so you can, access the slides at least. But again, if you want more detailed work on, how to approach anger from a Buddhist point of view in particular, again, that is what this book by Venerable Chodron is all about. She says in Buddhism, anger is a mental factor that, being unable to bear a person, object, situation, or idea, harbors ill will towards it or wishes to harm it. So again, this is the idea. It uses the phrase mental factor. It just means it's a component in our mind, something we can specifically identify as something that arises within our mental landscape. And again, it has that tendency of harboring ill will towards these various objects, a person, perhaps a person whose views we disagree with, who is harming us, an object such as a computer that isn't working the way you want it to, or a situation such as, plenty of situations, what's going on in terms of the protests that are happening in this country at times and what have you. Those are situations, right? Or an idea, certain ideas that people might hold and put forward that we might get angry towards or might have a mind of anger towards. So anger, it says there, covers a range of emotions. This is important to understand too. We're here using this term anger to refer to annoyance, irritation, frustration, spite, belligerence, resentment, hatred, rage. You kind of see it goes up in temperature as we go through these. I kind of tried to do that with the screen that I have there, of kind of the flames of anger that can go out of control. And this is actually an analogy that's frequently used for anger is the idea of a fire that just takes a small spark and it can go out of control. You all know that in California here where, fires start all the time from just the smallest thing, but, due to the weather conditions and what have you. One thing I want to point out here, His Holiness the Dalai Lama in his book that's called Healing Anger, which is actually his commentary on that chapter 6 on patience by Shantideva. He says that he prefers in English that we think about whether we should use this word anger, because in his estimation, the word anger also has a connotation of something positive in our culture. Like when we do have some kind of righteous anger, anger that is opposing those things in our world or in our country that are meant to be opposed because they are causing harm to others and what have you. And so certainly there are many causes over the history of this country as well as throughout the world that it has required some opposition. And as long as that opposition is done with compassion for both sides of the fence, everyone who's involved, then we can do that with some sense of, I don't know, outrage is maybe a strong word, but some sense of definite disagreement with what's going on and acting from that place of opposing something. But it's opposed with an understanding that, again, you want the best for everyone. You have compassion for everyone that's involved. So His Holiness does say that in his book, and I think it's well worth, again, having that attitude, at least. We're going to use the word anger tonight, not to refer to that type of mind, though. We're going to refer to the delusion of anger that I think, again, most of you have studied or looked at before. So this is the idea behind that. We just want to be clear that based on, again, the way that it's being approached here from Venerable Children's book as well, it's really this on the negative side, the annoyance all the way up through rage, all right? Then, in regard to patience, she talks about it as an alternative to either expressing or suppressing anger, because that was what she was talking about in this passage just prior to that. That, in our culture, we often think that expressing our anger is good. And even in Western psychology, there's a tendency to encourage people to express their anger, right? I remember kind of going to one workshop when I was living in San Francisco. It was based on some of the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And in this workshop, you would like take a radiator hose and wail on a telephone book. They don't have telephone books anymore, do they? I don't think. Anyway, those big telephone books, and that's expressing your anger, right? But it doesn't, in my estimation, do the trick. I didn't, I felt kind of some exhaustion after doing this, but I didn't really get rid of my anger, right? Suppressing anger, we're good at that in our culture too, right? Just kind of stuffing it in until eventually we're like a volcano and it blows. But it's, again, patience is the alternative to those sorts of behaviors. And it says patience is the ability to remain internally calm and undisturbed in the face of harm or difficulties. This is what we would, use as the definition for the word for patience. By the way, the word for patience in Tibetan is Zopa. Lama Zopa, who was their spiritual director, he was Lama Patience. And sometimes that was needed with Lama Zopa because he would often teach until, I don't know, 4 in the morning or something, 3 or 4 in the morning. So you had to be patient. But anyway, he was, yeah, definitely good at teaching us that. Again, having having zopa or patience means having an undisturbed mind, a mind that is not going to be perturbed by what's going on around us, but rather stay in a place of calm and peace. So it's a very proactive mind and a very difficult mind to develop, right? It's not something we're all born with. It's something we have to acquire through deep work and meditation. And a lot of the things I'm going to go through later in terms of antidotes are things that we need to meditate on and become familiar with so we can apply them. But I'll have a number of those that I'll share with you. Venerable Chodron goes on in this next slide. She says, the Sanskrit word Shanti, right, which is in Shanti Deva. Shanti Deva is actually the God of peace, is what that means. Deva is God and Shanti peace. And so Shanti has no suitable equivalent in English. Here we use patience, but Shanti also includes tolerance, internal calm, endurance. And again, I often hear it translated as peace, but the idea is it's a peaceful mind, an undisturbed mind. It has all these kinds of connotations, being tolerant in regard to what's going on, having this internal sense of calm, being undisturbed, and endurance, being able to forbear the difficulties. Thus, patience as it is used here also includes these qualities. So again, this is just something to kind of get us into the arena of what we're trying to cultivate. So what we're going to look at next is this whole process by which this mind of anger arises. And most of you know this as well, but I just want to reacquaint us with what are often referred to as the three poisons. Anger is one of the three, and it is one that is at the heart of a lot of our problems. These are called the three poisons because they are the poison by which our actions become problematic. The first one is the mind of attachment, desire, this craving, this wish to acquire things and hold on to them and what have you. This is the setup for anger in a sense. What happens is this is our default mode. And so we generally go about kind of trying to acquire the things that we think will bring us some happiness. And that's our default mode from the time we get up till the time we go to bed, pretty much. And even as we sleep, we want what brings us some measure of pleasure, happiness. This is where we're coming from constantly. And that's why, again, that's what we're craving and seeking throughout our day. Well, a lot of teachers, especially Venerable Rabina, who is one of my main teachers anyway, she often says that what happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants is we have the second of the three poisons. anger or again, aversion, um, hatred, even at times. Again, you can have stronger versions of it. But essentially, this is the mind that is objecting to getting the unpleasant stuff. So this is inevitable that this is going to happen every day, right? We start off our day kind of wanting things, and maybe for a little while, an hour or so, it kind of goes our way. We're still getting hot water out of the shower, and we're still having our breakfast, relatively undisturbed, and everything is seeming to go okay. And then maybe you start your commute, and suddenly it's a whole nother world, right? Traffic's incredibly backed up. There's an accident. You can't get where you want to go. You know you're going to be late. You had a meeting you needed to do. You have to reschedule the meeting. All this stuff starts piling on, and the mind starts getting anger, right? Because we're frustrated at the situation and trying to navigate that. Anger happens frequently again in those variations from annoyance all the way through rage as a reaction to getting what is unpleasant. Those two are what we vacillate between throughout our day: attachment to pleasant, anger, aversion towards what is unpleasant. It's all coming from a fundamental ignorance or confusion, though. There are different levels or types of ignorance and confusion in Buddhism, but the most fundamental one is the idea that we are clinging to a sense of us being this kind of concrete, solid entity, this I, this person, and we are navigating our lives around that presence, this thinking that there's this real person here that we are defending in all these ways. And I use the term real here. Lama Zopa Rinpoche used it all the time, but it's to refer to a specific way that we think we exist. And is that sense of us having some kind of independent, intrinsic existence, sort of able to set ourselves up. And we're going to talk later at the very end of this. That's, of course, the final antidote to your anger, is to apply the wisdom teachings, the teachings that say we are all actually empty of existing in that way. This is what the teachings on emptiness. And I have to touch on them as part of tonight because all of our anger is being driven by that delusion that thinks that we exist in this false way. And as long as we adhere to that, we're going to have these problems potentially of the mind having attachment and anger because this is what we're doing. We're revolving around this sense of a concrete I and trying to satisfy it. But it's not ever going to be satisfied. That's one of the problems as long as we're clinging to that I. But that I is the setup for these patterns. It's what causes us to go after the things that bring us pleasure and, remove the things that bring us pain. At the root of our basic desires, there's really no problem. Every one of us wants to be happy and doesn't want to suffer. And the Buddha didn't say that's a problem. He didn't say that's what we need to get rid of, that that's ignorance. He said, no, that's actually the fact. Every being does want to be happy and doesn't want to suffer. But because we build up this sense of an I that is pure fiction, we are only going to cause ourselves more misery and never be free from suffering and never find real happiness. And that's the problem. We're kind of going about trying to achieve what we want in totally wrong ways. There's another verse from Master Shantideva. I didn't put it in the slides, but essentially this is from the first chapter where he's talking about the mind of bodhicitta, the mind that aspires to benefit others through developing oneself to Buddhahood. He says in there that, sentient beings desire not to suffer, but yet they run towards its causes. And they want happiness, but they flee its causes. I mean, this is essentially what's going on, is that we're mixed up. We got our wires crossed. And instead of actually going towards what will bring happiness and avoiding what will cause suffering, we do the opposite. And we simply are never able to achieve the happiness we seek, nor find freedom from suffering, as long as we're buying into those fundamental patterns of clinging to this strong sense of an I, protecting it, wanting to get what it needs and keep it from experiencing anything bad. Underneath that is that desire to be happy and to not suffer. And again, no problem there. It's just how are we doing that? So this is something we'll examine a little bit more when we get to the end, if I've got enough time to squeeze everything in here. So this is the setup. We have that ignorance that acts as kind of the main root, the main poison, and then it gives rise to attachment, which is the more prominent one that plays, again, default mode that we're always coming from. We're like vampires trying to find our pleasure everywhere, whatever. And then we get angry and upset when we don't get that. All right. I also want to talk about these factors, and I don't want to spend too much time on all of them, but I want to introduce you to what are called the six factors that give rise to, well, really to all the afflictions, but I'm highlighting it for anger here. These first three that are highlighted there, these are the ones that are always there whenever we have a mind of anger or any of these other, root afflictions or any of the ones that are derived from that or other, delusions, afflictions in our mind, which are the things that upset our minds. We know anger upsets our mind because we experience it in that manner, but all of these various states of mind are causing a disturbance to some degree and afflicting us. The very first one's called here the basis. This means kind of the seeds or karmic imprints of the affliction. So what does this refer to? This refers to the fact that, according to Buddha, we've had beginningless lifetimes. So there is no beginning to our minds. And since beginningless time, we have had minds of anger, for example. I'll use that as the example as we go through this. And every time we have a mind of anger, it plants a seed to have another mind of anger. This is like one of the worst effects of following these minds is we keep creating the causes for them to recur. So every time you plant another seed on your mind, you're creating the potential for that seed to ripen. So every moment of anger gives rise to another moment of anger further down the road. When we meet with similar types of conditions where something is annoying and irritating for us, then that mind arises. So this is, again, something that we're not going to be able to get rid of until we do the deeper work, until you realize the wisdom of emptiness, that this I doesn't exist in this manner. So until you get rid of that, you're going to continue to follow this pattern and cause those seeds to keep ripening, and then plant new seeds when they ripen, and then cause those to ripen, plant new seeds, and so on. It just is a kind of never-ending process. So this is an important factor simply to understand that we are going to have that propensity. As much as we might work on patience at a more, kind of conventional level, we have to do the deeper work in order to remove it completely. But do the work at the conventional level. That's an important part of the process. That's what I'm going to mainly focus on tonight, is so that when we're not causing those seeds to ripen, we have different thoughts at that time. And I'll get to that in a moment. The thoughts that we have at that time are the third component that's involved in this. But let's look at the second one. The second one is, okay, first one, you have the seeds on your mind. The second one is that you have an object appearing to your mind. What is the object? The object can be anything. The object can be the sound of somebody's voice. The object can be, a scene that you're seeing on the news. The object can be your computer when your computer isn't functioning right. The object can be anything that will act in this case as inducing an unpleasant feeling. And that's really all that's happening is it's causing you to have an unpleasant feeling. Other people might be experiencing it too, and maybe they don't have the same unpleasant feeling, right? Because we all have different kind of propensities for different objects. Not everybody sees everything exactly the same. But the idea is here when we meet with an object that is unpleasant for us, that becomes the stimulus for the potential for anger to arise. Not that it's necessarily going to. That's the nice thing is that these objects can come into our lives and we don't have to have anger towards them, even when they are incredibly unpleasant, even when we are, habituated to seeing them in an unpleasant way. We might still be able to change it and not have anger arise due to overcoming the third factor. That third factor here is called incorrect mental attention, sometimes referred to as inappropriate mental tension, mental engagement. The idea here is that we start thinking about things in erroneous ways. And this is one of the things that we can change. The basis, the seeds, you're not going to be able to do that type of work until you have a much stronger concentration and a deeper understanding of emptiness. The second one, the object appearing to our mind, well, like Shantideva says, you can try to cover the earth in leather and kind of live in a place where you're not going to have disturbing things around you and what have you. But even the most idyllic place that you could live is going to have something to annoy you, right? So you can maybe avoid objects to some degree. But the third one we can do a lot about. The third one is how we're thinking in erroneous ways about those things we're experiencing that cause us to have that unpleasant feeling. So this is a whole thought process that we go through in terms of, you know, framing things in a particular way that's going to cause us to have the mind of of all, the root of it is that we think that the anger, or I'm sorry, the unpleasantness is inherent in the object. Because we're not only having that false thought about ourselves that we have some inherent existence, we think everything outside of ourselves has inherent existence. So we think that there's something embedded in that object when we experience it that is, unpleasant, undesirable, brings unhappiness, right? For example, if you hear the voice of somebody who you don't like, maybe on the political scene, I'm just throwing that out there as a possibility. You know, somebody who you have a negative attitude towards, right? You just hear their voice and you hear it as unpleasant. But again, we know it's not unpleasant for everyone because there are people who like that political figure and hear it as something pleasant, right? This is the world we live in. It's not, nothing is inherently there. So the first error we make is thinking that there's something inherent in there that is unpleasant. But then we build up the unpleasantness. We exaggerate it so that it becomes painted entirely with negative color, right? We cannot see anything but the unfavorable aspect of that. There's no room for us to see something that is different than that because that's how we're choosing to see it. That's this inappropriate mental attention. By the way, I want to point out, yeah, this is a thought process, and even anger in Buddhism is called a thought. I know in Western psychology we think of it as kind of an emotion or a feeling or something, and it almost seems to have a physiological basis, like, it arises in our body. And there is a physiological component to anger, right? We can feel the adrenaline rush and all the various stuff that happens and the tightening and the heart racing and all of that. That's all happening physiologically. But anger is a thought, and it's based on these inappropriate thoughts that are happening rapid fire. They're not happening like, oh, should I look at this as negative or shouldn't I? And should I exaggerate it or not? We just immediately see it as negative and we exaggerate that negative quality. So we're buying into it right from the beginning. We don't even question it. We don't even entertain any possibility that it's not the way that we're grasping at it. This is what's going on with that inappropriate mental attention or incorrect thinking, is that we are falling into that same pattern time and time again and seeing those things in the same way. We're also doing that with the mind of attachment. I'm not going to talk that much about attachment tonight, but it's there with all of these delusions. They are overlaying something that is not there. And you might wonder, well, why do we do that? Simply because we've been doing it since beginningless time and we haven't removed what causes us to do it, which is primarily that root of ignorance. When we remove that, then you won't be doing this. But in the meantime, we have to start replacing that incorrect mental attention with appropriate thoughts, with things that will actually cause us to have a totally different experience. And we won't have the affliction arise in response to that object that causes us to feel something unpleasant. We will instead have a healthy mind, the mind of patience, and a mind that could even be imbued with loving kindness and compassion. We'll get to that towards the end when I talk about these antidotes. But essentially, this is the choice that we have. But when we use the word choice, most beings don't have this choice, right? And even for us, we struggle with making that choice. When those things arise in our field of experience, we almost instantly go to that negative reaction. And that gives us the mind of anger. That is a product of that. When we start seeing things in that way through such a negative light, well, then this is fertile ground for anger to arise. So that's the main mechanism. These first three are absolutely there with every moment of anger, every moment of attachment, every moment of ignorance, every moment of whatever. So this is an important part to understand. The other three I just want to go through really quickly and relate them to anger because I think they do play a role, definitely, but they're not always the main factors. They might accompany the first three. Number four, habituation. Well, this is true to some degree with those people who do have an habituation to anger. I mean, you might have people in your life that say, "Oh, I can't be patient. I'm just angry. That's just how I am," right? They think that that's kind of, they've identified with that idea of anger so much that they think that's who they are. And by the way, I do try to point out sometimes when I teach on anger in particular, though other delusions as well, is it's good to have, even when we talk about it, and I try to do this when I teach, is to think in terms of not saying, I'm angry, because that's an identification of that deluded state of mind with ourselves. You do still exist in a very subtle way, but you don't exist again in that concrete way. But even just that pattern of saying, I am angry, well, you are not your anger. You know, your anger and you are not the same thing. Anger is a state of mind that comes through our mind and is not always there. At least I hope it's not always there for any of you, because if it was, that would be a pretty miserable life, right? But the person who is habituated to anger and they say, I am angry all the time, well, again, that means that that is something that is very strong in their mind, that they almost are thinking that that's who they are. Oh, I'm just an angry person. You just have to live with me, right? Well, again, anger is only arising on the basis of various causes and conditions, and it can be eliminated. So it's not really who you are. But when we talk about kind of identifying with things, the least identification is when we say there is anger in my mind. It simply is recognizing that that pattern has arisen in your mind. Kind of like a particular cloud that's in the sky. Oh, there's a cumulus cloud, and then it goes away, right? It's not there forever. And that's the best way to think about these delusions, is to think they're simply arising in our minds. And if even if you're habituated to a particular state of mind like anger, it's good not to identify with it and think, I am angry. And maybe even solidify it more by saying, I am an angry person. Like your personhood and anger are one, right? All right. So I just wanted to point that out. Habituation can play a role for many people because some people have been habituated to have the mind of anger very frequently. Unfortunately, their minds are tormented by that. Numbers 5 and 6, I'll talk about together. These are external factors, whereas the other three, well, the object is an external factor, but most of the other ones are primarily things within ourselves. The seeds are on our own minds. The mental attention is something that we're thinking of. Habituation is a pattern, a karmic propensity that we've created through habituating ourselves to anger. For 5 and 6, these are things that can influence your arisal of anger in this case, but they don't necessarily always play a role either. The fifth is influence of misleading friends or social distraction. I mean, we might have people who talk to us to incite our anger, right? They say, "Can you believe what happened today?" And da da. They, can't wait to like bombard your ear with all the things that are horrible that you don't necessarily want to hear, right? And they keep talking about it and almost validating your anger by the way that they are expressing their anger and outrage and what have you. This is what we might call misleading friends. I'm not saying that everybody who does this is somebody we have to avoid, but we have to be careful not to be influenced by others' anger. Or it says here social distraction. I mean, there are definitely many things in our culture now that weren't there in the time of the Buddha, such as, social media and the ability to see things online very easily that are going to be in that nature of causing our anger to be triggered. So we have to be careful that we're not bringing that stuff in and creating that habit and that pattern of, the mind getting upset and having anger in it because of these things. So watch that too. The sixth one, which was called kind of following false teachings, which is a here too, explanations, false teachings, things that are outside of ourselves that feed into the pattern of anger. I mean, one that I keep pointing out in a lot of the talks that I do these days, because I've noticed it when I watch particularly American movies. I don't know. I don't watch that many American movies these days because a lot of them are about revenge, right? Where there's somebody who's wrong towards the beginning of the film, and then the whole rest of the film is them trying to take revenge on the people who wronged them, right? That's kind of a subtle message that we get in our culture that it's good to get back at the people who've harmed you, right? That's essentially feeding our mind of anger, right? Saying your anger is perfectly justified because if somebody has harmed you, you're perfectly right, and that is what you need to do is to go, find a way to harm them. I remember my brother, he likes the John Wick movies. I don't know if anyone's seen these things with Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves played the Buddha in a film with Bertolucci, I think, did the film Little Buddha. But he does these films like John Wick is all about somebody seeking revenge, the whole thing. And I tried watching one of them and I had to turn it off. It was just not what I wanted to watch. I don't know. I'm not trying to put people down who enjoy that type of film. I just think we have to be really careful what we allow in because there are kind of subtle messages that we get in our culture. We call it here following false teachings, but even that may play a role. Like if you were involved in other spiritual traditions that maybe felt anger was perfectly fine in our world and it's a force for good. Well, then you may hear that, and that's feeding into your tendency to have anger. So these are just things to be aware of. They're the whole idea of causality is a big factor in Buddhism, right? We think that nothing arises sort of independently or on its own. There are always myriad causes and conditions that are involved in it. So it's good to understand these things that play a role in the arisal of anger. I also want to point out one other teaching that kind of informs how anger can often arise, and this is comes from the Salata Sutra. The Salata Sutra technically means the Arrow Sutra. It's in the Pali Canon of the Buddha. In this discourse, the Buddha talked about the two arrows, and sometimes people add a third one. At least one website I saw it said there can be potentially a third arrow, but the two arrows are an important thing to understand. The first arrow is essentially, in the previous slide, that object, number two, okay, causing us an unpleasant sensation. It can be physical, but it could also be something mental that comes to mind. The first arrow is the pain or difficulty being experienced that acts as the trigger. So that's bad enough, right, that we have first arrows, that we have things we have to experience that are unpleasant for us. But what's happening in the second arrow, and this is a way to frame that third factor, right? The incorrect mental attention. The second arrow are the painful thoughts we have about the first arrow that cause further mental anguish or pain because we feed that by thinking negative thoughts about that person or about that situation and feeding it to extreme degrees where then the mind of anger is right at home. We've created the perfect ground for anger to arise because we are kind of poking ourselves with a second arrow. The first arrow is bad enough, folks. I mean, we're all going to be experiencing first arrows. I mean, even the Buddha had some beings who were treating him somewhat unpleasantly, such as his cousin Devadatta. But the idea is that the first arrow is a part of samsara, part of being in this cycle of life, being a human being with a human body. You're going to have things that cause you pain or difficulty. Getting hit by the first arrow is going to be around for a while, all right? But the second arrow is totally optional. Even on the weekend, we talked about this idea of pain being kind of not, we don't have much choice in our pain, but we have choice in terms of suffering. And they often use that phrase for the second arrow. But here we're really talking about a mental process by which we suffer more. It's painful enough or suffering enough to be hit by the first arrow of pain. The second arrow is where we induce more suffering on ourselves by thinking about it in unhealthy ways, and ruminating on that and continuing to hold on to that. Now, the third arrow that's pointed out in this one website is the subsequent actions we do. Oh, it should be, got rid of that. I put subsequent at the front thinking I got rid of the other one. The subsequent actions we do that make the situation worse. I'll take that out of the slides later. So this is, going to cause us and others pain. This is kind of like a new arrow that's multifaceted or something. We often do things on the basis of the second arrow, right? Because that second arrow is our tendency, like I said, to ruminate and hang on to, hold on with resentment towards whatever was the first arrow. And then when we get the opportunity to meet the first arrow again, maybe the person who caused us to have that experience, well, then we're ready for the third arrow, and we throw it at them, but essentially we're throwing it at ourselves as well, because we're going to be hurt by that. The Buddha says karmically, that's the cause of our own future pain and suffering, that we keep doing things by these patterns. We have that mind that is already bad enough, and then we engage in things verbally or physically that are, going to exacerbate our pain even more. So this is a process that I think is a useful tool to kind of work with. And when I first encountered this back in Larry Rosenberg's book, Living in the Light of Death, I thought it was really a great teaching. I wondered why I never heard it in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition because it really isn't talked about much. but I think it's really a useful way of framing what is going on. Got lots of first arrows, folks, but the second one, totally optional. And if you don't do the second one, you never get the third one. You're never going to do anything subsequently that is acting out of that second arrow because you don't have it, you know, don't have that step. All right. Let's go on to talk about the effects of anger. I've kind of summarized them into some main categories. We all know that anger is very harmful to ourselves and to others, but let's take a look at some of what happens with anger. We have the more obvious, kind of manifest effects of anger that happen on us, that are there for us to witness in terms of ourselves. Anger makes our mind disturbed, discontented, unable to think clearly, make intelligent decisions, since your thinking becomes confused and irrational. Now, I've noticed this very much. When the mind of anger starts to arise, I feel like I'm not thinking straight, right? And I can't even speak straight because everything's kind of jumbled because it it's all under the agitation of anger. Anger also makes you physically agitated and tense and can contribute to certain health problems. Certainly people who have more anger in their minds are more prone to heart problems, blood pressure being high, all these kinds of things, because it does have a physiological component, as I said. It does cause adrenaline to rush through the body and what have you, and that's not very healthy for us, right? Anger can expose you to danger and lead you to destroy your own possessions. This sometimes happens, right? Where if you do get your phone's not working or something, and something happens, or somebody just called you and got you really upset, and then you throw your phone at the wall, and then you go, oops, just after you let your phone go and realize now you got to buy a new phone. I haven't done that. I'm just putting that out there as an example, but perhaps we have, destroyed our own possessions. Hopefully we haven't destroyed others, but that happens too. The obvious effects of anger on others around you. Well, it can cause others to ignore and shun you. Maybe they don't really want to be around someone who has a lot of anger. And we don't like to be around people who have anger, so it's understandable that people will have some avoidance of us. Anger, especially when expressed verbally or physically, can cause you to hurt others, even those you cherish, and to damage relationships with them. So we can cause a lot of pain to other people. I mean, it is interesting how maybe there's like one incident that happens between two people that were really quite close, and then suddenly the relationship's over, right? It could have been years and years, maybe siblings or other family members that suddenly there's something, and that happens frequently, as we know, when there's like a parent who dies and people trying to handle the estate and differences of opinion about what all should, take place. And then suddenly what was this long-term relationship is completely over, right? So we can have that effect on others where suddenly, they want nothing to do with us, and maybe we have that same attitude as well. But it can be very harmful to relationships. So we know this. Again, I don't need to dwell on it so much. Anger also can upset others, causing them to possibly even hurt you in return. In this way, we almost kind of become a contributing factor to other people's misbehavior. Because if we have anger towards them, we might be inciting a deeper anger towards in them that will be lashing out at us, or maybe lashing out at others even, right? This is one thing I often notice, and well, I hear about it. I don't know if I see it so much because if you have that little interaction with one person, say you're at the grocery store and somebody upsets you and then suddenly you yell at them, well, you don't know the chain of stuff that happens to them then. They might get angry and upset at the clerk at the counter, right, when they're checking out. And then they might even get angry and upset at somebody in the parking lot. And then before you know it, they're accosting everybody that they're meeting because you've set in motion a whole process where their anger escalates. It's kind of the contagion of anger. When we have anger ourselves, it's like we're throwing it on other people and then they've got to deal with it and they're throwing it on other people. And sometimes it becomes this perpetual process. So I don't know if other people have noticed this, but in Santa Fe, I've kind of noticed that it seems to be a lot of people driving with a lot of anger these days. I think it's just endemic to our culture and what's going on that people don't have healthy ways of working with their anger. And so it's coming out when they've got, what, couple tons of metal around them, when you have that kind of safe zone of things to protect you, you feel like you can let it out there and get angry and upset at all the people around you and maybe feel like you've relieved your anger to some degree, but again, not a healthy pattern. So watch what we do in terms of our anger out of concern for others and the behavior that they might engage in. Look at road rage and what happens when suddenly we're the person saying, to somebody they treated us unfairly through their driving or whatever, getting the parking spot that was ours, all this kind of stuff. It's just really horrible. Okay, the invisible effects of anger on you. Buddhism teaches that in terms of karma, anger leaves imprints on your mind that will bring unfavorable experiences in the future, thus causing you even more pain and suffering, you know, right? So this is the more karmic imprints of those the thoughts of anger and the behaviors of anger that follow that essentially ripen into experiences where we get more of the unpleasant stuff. It's just that's what gives rise to the unpleasant things in our lives. Anger can also destroy much of the good karma that you've created. This is what they often say, Master Shantideva's text. He says that you can destroy eons of good karma merit through the force of a mind of anger, particularly if that mind of anger is directed at a being who has great qualities, bodhisattvas, what have you. But even with just ordinary beings, it's good to be cautious about what we might destroy in terms of the good karma that we have, that we've been accumulating because we followed that mind of anger. Then finally on this screen, anger strengthens your seeds or propensities for it to arise in your mind again. Not only do you have the future experiences, but as I said earlier, you keep planting the seeds for another moment of anger in the future. It's this heinous sort of cycle that we're involved in. So those are the things that kind of play a role in terms of anger arising. So I want to move into antidotes, but before I do this, I want to just talk a little bit about this is really at the heart of so much of Buddhist practice, right? Is that there's these diluted states of mind, in this case anger, that is arising in the way that I described with all those various factors playing a role. And the way that we counteract it, I mean, you can do certain things initially. Certainly, avoiding the object is not a bad first defense. But we can you do that for the rest of your life and the rest of eternity? Probably not, right? Because invariably things come into our lives again and again that annoy us, that cause us to be irritated. That are they're gonna produce that unpleasant sensation, and we're gonna fall prey to it at some point. You can't possibly, again, as Master Shantideva said, cover the whole earth in leather and expect that then you can go anywhere you want and never have to worry about getting your feet pierced by rocks and what have you. So we have to have something to counteract that. The final antidote, and we'll talk about this at the tail end of tonight, is the wisdom of emptiness, where we get the the message that the person that we're trying to defend in these cases where we're having something unpleasant in our lives doesn't really exist in that way. And when we kind of realize that that's a facade, well, then when it falls away, there's nothing there that will be harmed because what is there is really, really slight. It's just this idea of a person, if you will, this imputation of a person. All right. So in the meantime, though, between these two of kind of like avoiding and then, the wisdom of emptiness, we need antidotes. We need things that we can apply in our minds, that we can bring to mind. But of course, you're not going to bring them to mind unless you're familiar with them. So that's the challenge, is that all the things I'm going to share with you are things that you really do have to practice to some degree. The initial things where it's just maybe a little bit of a blip in the mind where we're kind of moving in that direction, but it's not very strong, well, we may be able to counter those relatively easily. But when it becomes kind of we're on the track moving towards full-fledged anger, well, then we might need something stronger. But if you aren't familiar with it, well, then it's not really in your tool belt at that time. I like to think of these things like a tool belt. Or I remember watching Batman when I was growing up. I loved Batman. And he had a utility belt, right, or something where he had different things. I'd pull out this and go scaling up a building and pull out that, and it's a boomerang to hit the penguin or whatever. So so we need our tool belt. We need to have these things there, and when they need to be stocked. We need to make sure that it's not like Batman going to reach out there and there's nothing in there, right? So we have to be, again, that has to be part of our repertoire. We have to be able to think in those ways so that when these unpleasant objects come in, that second step, right? When, not the first arrow, but again, the second step in those six, that object is going to be unpleasant for us. Well, then we have a different way of thinking about it. All right. So that's the idea behind this. So I've divided these into some categories as well. First is that idea of decreasing the anger in the initial moments, which, again, with something that's not really quite full-fledged, where we're not really having like this horrific, experience that's really traumatic or something, I think these can be fairly easy to work with. Recollecting the detrimental effects of anger. Everything I just went through previously, right? All those detrimental things, the effects of anger. If you have a meditation on those to where you recall, well, then you may be able to counteract your anger arising just through recalling that. I mean, I see that this happens sometimes, right, when you're given a new diet from your doctor. Say your cholesterol is really out of control and he says, avoid this food, avoid that food. Well, then when you go out to like a restaurant and you look at the menu, you go, oh, that's right. I shouldn't really be eating so much of that. I've already had some of it today, and so I need to avoid it. Whatever, you have your own internal warning system that says, this is not good for me, so I'm not going to go there. And that's essentially what this first one is you having recollected through the force of your meditation on those the detrimental effects of anger. And so you're not going to go there because it's not so strong that you can kind of poof and the mind of anger just dissipates because you've put in its place a recollection of those faults. That's essentially what we're doing. We're coming up with a different thought at that time that isn't incorrect mental attention, that isn't focusing on that object and making it more unpleasant. It's actually thinking of the unpleasantness of following the mind of anger. The second one is observing the anger. Venerable Chodron talks about this a bit. She suggests sitting quietly and not paying attention to the storyline, but simply noting the sensations that arise and pass as anger flows through you. Where you're not, again, it may not be full-fledged anger, but it's kind of those thoughts, that initial thing. Become even a bit curious, I think, about what is it like to sit with this and this discomfort, and to not be immediately going to that place of, I've got to retaliate or something has to be done, but simply observing it. And like I said, I think this may be more effective at the beginning when you have the initial moments. It's interesting. Oftentimes things are quite small in the mind when they start, and that's you can catch things right there if it's not a big experience to begin with, or you have the wherewithal to note that it's arising. Then simply pulling back and not following the storyline of, oh, why did the person do this and what's going on for them, and I know I'm right and I know they're wrong and da 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 da, all that stuff we tell ourselves. Simply noting what is going on, what's happening mentally, physically with you that you can clearly identify and just watch it as it passes, as it flows through you, right? Okay. Any questions on those? Maybe I'll stop for a moment and take a drink of water. So, anything anyone wanted to say up to this point? And anyone? Ah. Yeah. Diane is just saying, yeah, that to the idea of observing or watching your anger. She said she didn't think she's ever done that in her life, but maybe you have. But anyway, yeah, I think that it's kind of, again, being more of like a internal scientist, right? You're going to just watch the process of what's going on. I mean, having that, and of course, to do that does require to some degree an ability to have some mindful awareness so that you then can be with it and not get caught up in it, right? You have to be able to observe more. Yeah. Is it Madhulika?
Yes. Hi, Don. How are you doing? Thank you so
I,
much for a
I'm
beautiful
doing fine. We need
presentation.
to turn the volume up just a little bit here in the Gompa so I can hear you. Hold on.
Sure.
Is that okay? Please go ahead.
I'm sorry I'm outside. I am just taking a walk, so that's why I haven't turned on my video.
All
But
right.
I was wondering if as you observe the anger, and you mentioned the physical characteristics. For example, I've observed that there is a tightness in, let's say, the pit of my stomach, and or a tightness around my throat, and then I know immediately that that emotion is sort of arising, and sometimes tears build up. But these are symptoms of anger. It takes a long time to apply an antidote such as patience, because you really have to change the narrative that is behind those feelings. And I struggle with it a lot. do you have any tips for
Hmm.
beginners who want to apply quick antidotes aside from suppressing, which is what I tend to do, and then that's not a good thing.
What's that? You tend to do what? That's not a good thing. I didn't hear that.
I tend to suppress.
To suppress.
Suppress,
Sorry, I wasn't
yeah.
word. Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, quick antidotes. It's like quick oats versus the regular oats. You know, you can never make the regular oats quickly. You have to use the quick oats, but I don't know. I
I just, the only thing I can think of is okay, go back and say a mantra, something, distract myself. I don't
yeah.
know.
No, and I think there's some value to that. I didn't put that on the list, but there's that many mantras that are said to be, if we use the etymology, look at the etymology of the word mantra, it actually means mind protection. And of course, we use mantras in that capacity where when we begin reciting mantras, it often does protect our minds because we become more focused on that and the energy of those mantras, which, like the mantra of the Buddha of compassion, Om Mani Padme Hung, is said to embody that compassionate being. And so just by saying it, you are bringing
Mm,
that to mind. And I don't think there's anything wrong with those sorts of more immediate things. Like as soon as you experience something that is triggering that and it's causing again the tightness that you were mentioning in your throat or in your, chest or whatever, and then to say, oh, I need this right now is a more immediate thing. I guess though I wouldn't in any way discount all of that, I'm just saying it also is helpful if you cannot do it in the moment to maybe once more when you're at a place where you can sit down and do a little more reflection to then introduce some of the things that I'm going to be presenting next, the thoughts that will hopefully come up a little more quickly as well. It all is a matter of familiarity. I mean, that's what most of our practice is, right? In fact, again, the Tibetan word for meditation, gom, means to become familiar. And so, what we're trying to do in our meditation and reflection is to become familiar enough with these things so that they are in our tool belt and we can bring them out fairly quickly. So it may not be the first thing we go to right away in the beginning. Maybe it is reciting a mantra or bringing to mind, something. I know some people even like they think about their gurus or their teachers, those who have instructed them in all of this. And by thinking about them, they think, oh, if they were here watching me, would I behave this way? Would I follow that mind of anger? That can be a useful tool for some people as well. But I see those as kind of, again, more I'm not discounting their relevance. I think they're very relevant, but they don't get to the heart of this process I was talking about earlier, where we are actually able to introduce different thoughts that are actually more constructive. I'm saying a mantra is constructive, but I think it's if you were to be able to bring a compassionate thought into your mind at that time while reciting the mantra, that would be even more powerful, right? So that's the idea is that if we're familiar, we're going to see love and compassion on the list here of an antidote, harder one to practice because we often don't have anything approaching love or compassion for that being who's harming us at that time or who we don't like. But if you were to bring that to mind and recite the mantra, that would be even more powerful. But simply reciting the mantra, if it works in the beginning and at those places where we're trying to catch it before it gets too large and out of control, well, then absolutely. I think that's a good process to engage in. So,
thank you, Don.
oh, sure. Did I pronounce your name correctly then? Madhulika?
Yes,
Okay.
perfectly.
Oh, okay, good. Well, continue enjoying your walk. Be careful.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. Any other questions before we get more deeply into this? Got about 20 minutes left. I think I can cover most everything, but yes, Aaron. Mm, mhm. Kind of piercing us. Yeah. Oh, I don't know. In terms of Aaron's asking about the arrow and how are we to take that, the Buddha using that analogy for this. And I think because I've never been pierced by an arrow, but I think we just think of it as something that would be really painful, right? Again, many people frame that first arrow in terms of it being a physical experience, a sensory experience that is physical. But like I said, I think we can have mental experiences that are painful as well, right? Like say you remember something from your past suddenly, and then it's like you're going back to that. It was initiated by maybe something physical or visual or, oral, whatever, and then suddenly, we're back in that place. But yeah, I think it's purely out of the thing of it being something that would be very painful to experience, and then the idea that we're adding a second arrow on top of it is like, hey, what are we doing to ourselves? So I don't know. But well, both of them in a sense, because again, karmically, you create the first arrow. You wouldn't experience the first arrow if you didn't have the karma to experience the first arrow. But that we don't have much control over, right? When the causes and conditions come for our karma to ripen into that painful experience, that first arrow, that's something we don't have much choice, right? That's going to happen. It's going to be, again, the stuff we have to encounter throughout our lives. The second arrow is purely optional, is really where we have, oh, I don't need to pierce myself again with anything equally tormenting and traumatic. I'll just try to deal with the first arrow, you know. So, yeah. Okay, good, good. Let's carry on and move on into the next category. Did you have something, Karen? I wasn't sure. No? Okay, I wasn't sure. I thought I saw your hand go up for a second, but okay. All right. Let's go to the second category of antidotes. Oh, I'm sorry, this is one more in regard to the initial moments. This is kind of this idea that sometimes, and I think again with something that is much smaller in terms of the what's registering as unpleasant, if we simply accept the situation as what is happening and then examine it to proceed appropriately by either putting energy into remedying things if things can be changed, or simply relaxing and acknowledging that it cannot be changed if that's the case. Master Shantideva here in his sixth chapter has that wonderful verse that embodies this, right? If it's something we can do something about, well, then why worry, get angry, get stressed, get anxious? Because it's something you can do something about, right? You put your energy into solving it, because the Buddha didn't say don't ignore the world out there. He said if it's something you can change, maybe your phone's really giving you, as I would use that as an example of an object that's not a person. If your phone's really giving you problems and it keeps like dropping calls or doing something, well then, maybe you need to get a new phone. Maybe there's something wrong with your phone service. Change providers, do whatever, right? What the anger and upset about it isn't really doing any good. You do what needs to be done to address what's amiss. And that's not, again, something we can do all the time. And maybe sometimes we can even deal with some things and not get upset and angry. But if it is something you can remedy, Master Shantideva says, well, then put your energy there. The other part of that verse is if it's something that cannot be remedied, well, then what use is worry and anxious mind and anger and whatever else is going to arise, right? This is in his chapter on patience. He's essentially saying that if it's something that cannot be changed, or that would be, again, almost impossible to imagine how it could be changed, right? Because it's just, for example, those political figures coming on, our TV screen or computer and saying the things that they're saying. Can I change what they're saying? Can I do anything to, I mean, I would like to hope that I could, but I don't think I have the potential. I don't think I have the ability. So I might just have to accept that and just relax and recognize that the mind of anger is not good to follow because it's not going to do anything. There's nothing I can change about it. So why all the anger? Why all the upset? Again, might channel it into that more righteous anger that His Holiness was talking about, where we're justifying, a stance that we need to take in opposition to these things out of a sense of compassion for the beings who are being harmed as well as the harm givers. That's a whole different approach, right? But essentially, this is some criteria that we can use. Is it something that can be changed? Is it something that can't be changed? Well, then there are appropriate responses for each of those. But anger is not an appropriate response for both of them, right? Okay, so that's the initial things, and you may find useful. If you remember Master Shantideva's verse, which, by the way, is kind of similar to the Serenity prayer that some of us have, used in our life, right? It's got the theistic side of God, give me the strength to change, or the courage to. Let me I always get it messed up when I start to give me the courage to change the things I can, the strength to accept the things I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? It's Master Shantideva's verse, essentially, right? I want the courage to change what I can. I want the strength to endure what I cannot change. And know the difference, know that you're not railing against one thing in an inappropriate way. So this is just a few little points under understanding the nature of things. In Buddhism, we talk about how most of the condition, or all the conditioned things, most of the things in our lives are impermanent and they change. I mean, recall that, there was that phrase again from a Christian tradition that I grew up around, this too shall pass, right? Anything we're experiencing doesn't last forever. It comes and it falls, because that's the nature of things. And our minds are impermanent. Everything is impermanent. And so why are we grasping at it as if it's going to be there forever? Because that's part of the overlay that we often have when we experience that unpleasant object. Secondly, remembering the nature of samsara, I used this term earlier. I think most of you know it. It's referring to what's often called the cycle of existence. Samsara is the state of being conditioned that we are currently in. We're under the control of our karma and these delusions, especially those three poisons. We are going from life to life and experiencing dissatisfaction. The Buddha used that word dukkha. We talked about it a lot over this weekend. It means not just the suffering and pain that is often the trigger for anger, but even deeper levels of unsatisfactory states that we are in. So essentially, if that's the nature of samsara, when we experience anything that is unpleasant, it's just more evidence, right? Making our case against samsara and desire not to be in this state. In Buddhism, we would often kind of funnel that into what we call renunciation. The mind that says, I've had enough of this nonsense and I want to emerge from it once and for all. So it's a very powerful mind that we can kind of move into. This will even come up a little bit on Thursday when we talk about Lojong in mind training. One way to transform any problem or difficulty is by thinking about how it gives us the evidence that this is what we're moving away from. This is what we don't want to be involved in anymore. So develop renunciation at that time rather than anger. Oh, yippee, helps us to get the heck out of samsara, help others out of samsara. The last one, putting the situation in perspective. I mean, this is something I often have some hesitation about. It's mentioned in Venerable Chodron's book. But, we often say that, well, this is a first world problem that you're dealing with, or it's not really something that serious and other people are suffering so much worse. It was kind of like what I heard from my parents, oh, people in Africa are, suffering so much worse or whatever. I mean, you hear these and I'm that's where I'm somewhat hesitant because I think some of us have a kind of negative attitude towards comparing suffering from one person to another. But at the same time, it does give some space for people on occasion where we think, really, is this so intolerable? Is what I'm going through so bad that it kind of deserves a mind of anger when I look at what's happening to so many people in the world and what's going on? It might be better for me to have more cognizance of all of their experiences and kind of think about them in wanting their suffering to be relieved rather than me having a mind of anger and getting upset at my own suffering when my own suffering is not as significant. So there's a bit of that kind of moving in that more selfless, compassionate vein. So I throw it in there anyway. I think it's good to touch on. Some of us may find it still quite useful to say, what I'm going through isn't really as bad as what so many beings are going through at this very time. I mean, think about people in, uh, you know, Iran, in Gaza, Ukraine, what have you. All right. Another set of antidotes, reflecting on aspects of causality, which I touched on earlier, right? Recollect even your own role in creating the situation. In a sense, we have made ourselves a target whenever something unpleasant comes into our lives, and we choose to see it in that way. Again, that's kind of the first arrow has happened, right? And we created that through our own karma. And we might be, kind of taking on the whole thing of exacerbating things by thinking that the other person is to blame, that it's somehow their fault, right? When actually we were the main creator of that. They acted as an agent of doing that to us, right? They were not denying that they said or did what they did. But the fact is, you wouldn't be experiencing it if you hadn't created the karma for it, right? So that's one part of it. And sometimes we can even look at it and go, well, what did I do that perhaps made this person react that way? Not to blame the victim, that kind of mentality, but rather to look at it and say, I could have played a role in terms of my own sensitivity. Because sometimes people can be pretty sensitive to things that other people may not even acknowledge was an issue, right? Oh, I didn't know that you were going to be sensitive to that, right? Well, that's our own stuff. That's our own sensitivity. So we have to be aware, to what degree are we going about thinking everyone is supposed to just say pleasant and wonderful things to us, and whenever they say something that's different, well, we get bent out of shape because we're just way too kind of sensitive is probably the best word. I don't know, maybe there's a better word out there, but Master Shantideva even says, if somebody is injuring your body, well, or why even get mad at them for that? Because you created this body. Your body is your own karmic result. So, if you created a body that can be pierced by arrows or, bruised by rocks or whatever the case might be, or, insulted by words that somebody else is saying, you've set up the target. So why are you totally upset at them when in reality it's a mutual thing? And that's a bit of what we're going to talk about in the rest of these. You can also look at the fact that you want to see things from the other person's point of view. Oftentimes, we're not doing that when the mind of anger is arising, right? We're thinking only of our own point of view, the way we see things, what we are valuing at that moment, which is our own happiness, tends to be. And we have to see what led to their position, what led to them doing the things that they do. There's that phrase, I think they use it a lot in AA, which is hurt people hurt people, right? People who are hurt others. And so we don't know the burdens that that person may be carrying. And even just to entertain the question, you don't have to, when somebody says something rude to you, you don't have to stop and say, hey, what's going on for you that you're doing this to me? What's all in your history? That's not the job. It's just to reframe it in that way and saying, I don't know what's been going on for that person. I don't know what kind of day they've had. I don't know what kind of life they've had. I don't know what's happening. Why am I, feeling again that I can pigeonhole it and think it's exactly this, my thoughts about it, when it could be something else. Could even be that they're on medication that is making them irritable, right? That happens, where suddenly there's something else is going on with them physically that's causing them to be really quite sensitive to things because of the conditioning of that medicine in their body. We don't know these things. So it's at least entertaining some doubts about, well, what's going on for the other person? What is their situation? What is their thinking? What are their needs even, right? Acknowledging, and the last one, how we co-create situations. There is no situation that's created totally from one side. Again, even karmically, we have to acknowledge that you have the propensity for that to happen. It ripened, and that's why it's happening to you. And so that's a co-creation karmically. But once more, I think we do play a role to some degree, at times at least, in the setup, in something coming into play. And it's not just blame the other person or blame ourselves and feel guilty and horrible. It's acknowledging the interdependence. Interdependence, of course, and causality are big teachings in Buddhism. And anyway, that's enough to kind of touch on those. This is where we start to get into maybe the harder ones. This is generating a more positive regard for the other person, right? I tend to be focusing throughout this, by the way, on people. I've mentioned, phones and computers and what have you as objects, but it's the people where we really have the greatest danger, right? Because that's the beings that we can harm and can harm us and harm others and what have you. So this is where we have to really work on diminishing our anger. First of all, separate the person from their behavior, recalling that they are not harmful by nature, and thus cultivate compassion towards them. Master Shantideva has this little investigation in his text where he essentially says, is it in the nature of sentient beings to harm one another? And you might think, oh, maybe it is. There's certainly a lot of harm going on around there, right? Well, maybe it is in their nature. Well, then he puts forward the argument, well, then why would you begrudge them for that if that's really their nature? That would be like begrudging fire because it burns. If that's the nature of fire is to burn, when it's the nature of people to have anger and do violent things or whatever, and well then it's the same thing. Why would you begrudge that? You just would accept it, that that's the nature of beings, that they do it. And to some degree, this is kind of true because most beings, under the control of their delusions, have no choice but to act in this way, really. As I said, the choice comes in when you know what's going on in your mind and you know that you can actually decide to do something different. Most beings don't even have cognizance of that. Right? They're going about their lives under the control of these factors. That's why we often use that phrase, right? Under the control of karma and delusions. So, hey, if that's what's happening to most people, it's like, again, begrudging somebody who's on that medication that causes irritation, that if they're having that influence, well, then what can they do about it? Now, again, we know in Buddhism we can do something about it. That leads to the second possibility in Shantideva's logic. If it is something that is not in their nature, well, then again, the problem is that thing that's not in their nature. It's not them. Why have anger towards the being if they're being controlled by something else? The example he uses for that is if you have somebody hitting you on the head with a stick. I don't have my little bell ringer thing, but like if you have somebody hitting you on the head with a stick, well, what do you get mad at? You get mad at the person, right? And you say, well, why? Because the stick is being wielded by the person, right? That's why you don't get mad at the stick, but it's the stick that's hitting your head, right? But then Master Shantideva says, well, but the person's being wielded by their delusion. The delusion is what's causing them to behave in that way and hit you with the stick. So they're also under the control of something else. So the idea is that this is the nature of beings, actually, is that they're under the control of their own delusions, their own selfishness, their own, being driven to go after what brings them happiness in these, horrible ways and avoid suffering in the horrible ways they are. That's what the illness that we're all dealing with. And we at least have an awareness of it. Most of them, again, don't have any awareness. The most appropriate response is compassion because they're a being that is under the control of these factors at that time. They use an example here too. I don't know if it's in Shantideva's text, hear it in some of the Lam Rim texts where they say, if your own dear mother was on some medication that made her act crazy and like start wailing at you and try to hit you and whatever, if that was happening, you would have total compassion and forgiveness because you understand that she's under the control of this thing with psychotic side effects or whatever, and you wouldn't like be holding her as this horrible evil person, right? But when somebody else does that without that knowledge, or like we would definitely do the anger thing, and we would say, "Oh, this person's horrible and awful," right? So this is the idea is that we have to have that view of like everybody potentially being under the control of a substance that's causing them to have these deluded states of mind. And that substance is their own minds with delusion that they haven't addressed. They use this term that the afflictions and all are adventitious, meaning that they're only there because we haven't created the causes to remove them. They just continue to thrive and be in the mind. Once you introduce all the causes that get rid of them, they're gone. You know? So this is the condition that all beings are in. So compassion is the only logical response. The other one is to kind of, kill them with kindness. We use that phrase. I hate that kind of kill part of it, but it's really the idea. I'm going to smother them with kindness. Remember that this is a being who wants to be happy and not suffer, just like you and everyone else, and respond to their hostility with kindness. I mean, this does happen, right? Where in the face of somebody doing something really horrible, suddenly somebody comes forward with kindness and with a more, caring stance, a little more, you know, shower them with love at that time rather than fighting back at them with all this other hostility and anger. So again, you have to be trained in these much deeper to practice them, but this is the ideal thing to do. I think some of you know Sujata Balata, I think is her last name. She's a Buddhist teacher who's affiliated mostly with Kyoto Center up in Richmond. I saw, no, it wasn't her. I'm sorry, I'm making up a story about her that she's a wonderful teacher, and I'm not in any way saying that I know this. The story had to do with oh, what's her name now? She's the woman who wrote the book uh She's been doing her whole revolutionary love campaign. She's an author of two books now, and she's wonderful. She's Sikh. And anyway, there's a picture of her at one of the protests that was happening towards the beginning of this current administration, where there were all these forces lined up in Southern California. Remember when you had all them kind of invading and doing their thing? And she's placing a flower in front of them on the ground, to offer them a flower. What is her name? I can't think of it right now. Anyway, she's a beautiful author. Something about no strangers. Her whole thing is like strangers are just beings who we haven't learned to love yet, that there's always that potential for us to love any being. So that's the big one there. The last one, cultivating awareness of the ultimate reality of emptiness. And I'll just go through this quickly, and you'll just have to tune into other teachings on emptiness from me or other teachers to get more information. But you can do kind of the two-pronged approach. One is to analyze to see if you can find the I that is hurt and that seems so solid and existing on its own. Of course, in Buddhism, we do this analysis where you essentially bring to mind and feel it. And when you have been threatened by this unpleasant situation, the sense of I is very strong, and it feels very solid, very real. Go looking for it. Say, and maybe you have to say, can you hold on a moment? I need to do an analysis. The other person's like standing there yelling at you or something. Maybe this is something you do after the fact, but you have to go looking. Where is that strong I that you feel is absolutely here, somewhere in this collection of stuff, and you don't find it. It's kind of a interesting exercise. That's what emptiness is the lack of that, the emptiness of that. The other side of it is really understanding this very slight way that the I exists, and essentially through a process of interdependence and causes and conditions, seeing the interdependence of the I and the body and mind. See that they exist in relationship and not separately. That you essentially have this relationship of the I being what is the designation and the body and mind being what is designated. We have a body and mind, every one of us. That body and mind is simply called I. There's kind of a labeling, a designating of this as I. Those two exist interdependently. There's the basis for the designation, the body and mind, and that which is designated, or the label designated on it, the label of I. Those exist interdependently. We talk about this being dependent relation or dependent arising, that these two, again, are kind of um, existing in that mutual way. Again, the basis that is going to be designated as I, and then the I that is designated to that basis. Just when you bring that to mind, it should start to loosen some of that tightness of grasping at this real I. When you see that really all that is here, that is I, is a thought, is a label that we give in relation to this. It's enough for it to exist. It's what we call nominal existence, but it's no more than that. And the mind of ignorance thinks it's much more than that, thinks it's solid and absolutely here without a doubt, existing on its own independently. And when we think that it's existing in this very subtle way, it's like, again, the target's gone. Yeah. All that's there is just a designation. Because even if you go investigate the body or the mind, well, they don't exist in that concrete way either. Body's a label we give to this physical collection of stuff. And none of the parts of the body are the real body, and so on. And most of you have had teachings on emptiness before, but it's a very profound truth. I've kind of presented these remedies, these antidotes, in the order of more complexity and more difficulty to apply them. But obviously, if we get up to this level, the final level, that's the final antidote we need. That's what will really unlock the whole thing. So I've gone about 5 minutes over, I think, right? We're going to end at 8, correct? Yeah, I just want to make sure I got the starting time wrong. So I want to make sure I got the end time right. But I do want to entertain any questions or comments that people have. If there's anything anyone wanted to share or ask. Yes, please, Tina. Uh, 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 Right, 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 right. Perfect. Right. Good. That's perfect, Tina. Yeah, Tina was just saying for those at home that it's useful to maybe think kind of, I used preemptively, you said pre-compassion, but like a preemptive thought. So if you're going to be meeting with somebody who's difficult, you've had difficult experiences with them before, and you're fearing that it will be it's Thanksgiving dinner with your relative that you can't stand or whatever, that is always annoying you, well, then you meditate on compassion or you meditate on whatever the remedy is that you feel you want to apply so that when you are in that situation, you're ready for it. And that's, again, what we want to do with this whole tool belt idea is like, because as you said, not everybody we meet, even we might not, we might have the hope that they're going to be caring and kind and what have you, but a lot of people aren't. So when we run into them, what do we have kind of in store ready to apply at that time? And if we don't have anything, then again, we can do our best and try to make it through, but chances are we're going to step in it. And if you step in it, that's all fine. But at least you had the cognizance of, I don't really want to step in it. And maybe after the fact, you go, yeah, what could I have done better or whatever? You do some sort of post analysis. But the pre stuff is really important, because otherwise you can hear all this again, and then you get to the actual, situation, and it's like, okay, I don't have anything to draw from because all I've done is heard about it and haven't had, again, the practice, like you said, that really helps strengthen it. So, yes, Karen, please can unmute and share what you'd like to.
Yeah, I don't have much to share. I just wanted to say I've been trying to take copious notes, and I wonder if you're going to have your slide deck available to us later, or
Mhm.
I tried to take notes.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. I'll be sending them to Diane either later tonight after this or tomorrow, and she has the registration list of everyone who came, and so she will happily, thank you, Diane, send my slides out. And I think this is being recorded as well, correct? Yeah. Well, I didn't. You must have, yeah. And so will it be posted then on YouTube? Okay. I'll send out the link. Okay, so the link will also be sent out so you can watch the video again if you'd like to. If you didn't get enough of me the first. If you can deal with that first arrow of Don talking. No. Anyway, thanks. Thanks, Karen. It's so good to see you. Yeah. All right. Any other comments? Are you ready to conclude for the evening? Okay. Let's take a moment to kind of dedicate all this positive energy. So again, we've learned a lot of things, and maybe just before we leave, it's always good to say, well, what's the one thing that I want to be sure to take away from tonight? Kind of that one thing that I think will make some difference in my own approach to anger, my own understanding, my own practice. I think it's always good to just kind of fine tune it to that. There's a lot of things that we talked about, but if there's one thing in particular that you felt like had an aha moment or something like that, hopefully I've created some opportunity for that in your mind, then take that away. Just be cognizant of that and maybe sort of, put a post-it on it or something that you will remember that. Then let's dedicate all the positive energy we've created for the benefit of all beings so that we ourselves can overcome our anger, again, on a more conventional basis through these antidotes, these more temporal antidotes, and then finally develop the ultimate antidote, the wisdom that will cut through our ignorance and all the delusions that are built on our ignorance, freeing ourselves from samsara, but moreover, freeing us from everything that blocks us achieving our full potential, the state of Buddhahood, so we then can help others to attain that same state. And let's dedicate for the good health and long lives of all our precious teachers, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama, But even Venerable Chodron, whose work on, astounds me. She's done so many books and teachings and what have you. I think she's going to be teaching for Sitchin Ling either later this month, I think. I thought I saw the notice. But anyway, yeah. All these amazing teachers that are helping us. May they have good health. May they have long lives. And may they continue to be in this world as a positive guiding influence for ourselves and others. And may Lama Zopa Rinpoche's reincarnation be swiftly identified so that being can be of incredible benefit as well, carrying on the legacy of his predecessor or her predecessor, whoever that being is. So again, continuing to have that being in this world to benefit us and others. And lastly, I think it's really good to dedicate for those beings you're holding in your heart. And maybe kind of stretch your concern here a bit. You normally think about the people who are quite close to you, people who we know are experiencing obstacles and difficulty. We want them to be alleviated of that, to be relieved of any pain and challenges, obstacles, illness, the pain of dying or what have you. I mean, all these things. It's good to bring that to mind. But also, let's think for a moment about those beings who do push our buttons, the ones who are the troublemakers in our world, and kind of generate a wish that what we did here tonight could be a benefit to them, causing something to shift and change in them, to bring them to a place of greater compassion, greater wisdom, so that they can cease doing what they're doing. And we can also extend this energy out to places in the world where there's great harm and suffering right now. And lastly, we just make the aspiration, may all beings find happiness and peace and be free from all suffering through what we've done here together tonight. All right. Thank you all. Sorry for keeping you here a bit later, but that's how it goes. You all know me by now. Never end on time, I don't think. So, all right, everyone. Thank you all online, and thank you everyone in the Gomfa here as well. And I'll be here on Thursday night again for a little. It's going to be some things that we talked about, but yeah, more in the vein of this Lojong mind training teachings that I think most of you are familiar with as well, but kind of looking at that and how do we do that in daily life, so that we're really using that tool. Okay. Bye, everyone.